1883, Arizona Territory. A widowed rancher told his son and daughter they could have anything they wanted from the mercantile. Anything at all. What he did not expect was for them to look past every trinket and bolt of cloth, past every jar of hard candy and painted tin whistle, and point at the quiet Apache woman trading baskets in the corner. What started that afternoon as an embarrassing moment in a dusty trading town slowly grew into something that crossed every line the frontier had drawn. But when the territory turned against them, and the children's safety came down to a wash gone to whitewater, it would not be a man's gun that saved them. Watch till the end, and if stories like this, one move you, hit like and subscribe. It means more than you know. We begin. The summer of 1883 arrived in the Sulphur Springs Valley like an uninvited creditor. Early, dry, and already tired of being polite. The high desert grass had gone brown by June, and the afternoon sky above the Dragoon Mountains carried that bruised copper color that old ranchers read as a warning. Eli Hatch rode the fence line on his gray quarter horse every morning before the heat set in, patching posts and checking wire, doing the things a man does when staying busy is the only thing standing between him and his own head. He was 34 years old and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the work. His wife, Clara, had died the previous November of a fever that moved through the valley fast and spared no one it decided to take. She had been 31. Eli buried her on a low rise behind the barn, where she'd always said the light was best in the late afternoon. He put up a flat stone and planted a young cottonwood beside it, and he did not look at that rise more than he had to. He had 2 children. Tomas was 9, named for Eli's late grandfather, already stubborn as a mule about being called Tom instead. Rosa was 6, small and quick, in possession of a memory that made grown men nervous. She could recite the exact words Eli had said at supper 3 weeks prior, right down to the pause he made before the part he regretted. Both children had their mother's eyes, dark, brown, steady, the kind that didn't look away when something needed to be seen. Since Clara died, something had gone quiet inside the house. Not silent. There were still chores and arguments and the ordinary noise of a working ranch. But the quality of that quiet was different, heavier, like a room with all the furniture shoved against the walls. Eli did what he could. He learned to braid Rosa's hair after a fashion, badly, but with the earnestness of a man who knew the trying was part of it. He let Tomas sit up with him in the evenings, rather than sending him to bed on the hour. He told the children their mother was not gone, only riding ahead, and that was a thing he half believed and half did not, and he did not look too hard at the dividing line. He'd taken to bringing them into Tres Cruces on the first Friday of each month, when the mercantile restocked, and there was a small bustle to the town that almost resembled life. He would let each child pick one thing, not much, enough to mark the day as a good one. He figured small kindnesses, offered reliably, were a kind of architecture, something to build against the emptiness. On the first Friday of July, the mercantile was crowded and hot. The clerk, a thin man named Peabody, had laid out a new shipment, bolts of printed calico, a rack of hat pins, glass candy jars, carved wooden toys, and a set of hand-painted tin cups that caught the light when you turned them. Eli leaned against the counter and told the children what he always told them. Take your time. Anything on the shelf. Tomas drifted toward the wooden toys. Rosa stood very still near the door, which was how Rosa always stood when she was thinking hard about something. Eli watched her without watching her, the way a man learns to watch children after a year of raising them alone. The door opened and the afternoon light came in ahead of her. She was perhaps 25 or 26, though the desert sun made ages hard to fix precisely. She came in carrying 4 baskets stacked inside each other, balanced against her left hip, and she moved through the room the way water finds the low path, without effort, without ceremony. She was Western Apache, Chiricahua band by the look of her moccasins and the geometry of the basket designs, though Eli was not certain and knew better than to say. Her hair was braided, one thick braid over her right shoulder. She wore a cotton blouse the color of red earth, and a deerskin skirt with a beaded border along the hem. She did not look at the men at the counter. She set the baskets down, spoke briefly in Spanish to Peabody, who made a note in his ledger, and then began examining the shelves with an unhurried attention that suggested she had nowhere more important to be. The room did what rooms like this always did. Conversation sagged. One of the ranchers near the window shifted his weight and turned his back. Peabody found something urgent in the ledger. Eli Hatch looked at her for a moment, then looked away, because that was what a decent man did. Her name, he would learn later, was Ishke, a Chiricahua word. She told the children, when they eventually asked, that it meant something close to a woman who knows her own way. She did not say this with any pride in it. She said it the way a person states a plain fact, expecting you to receive it plainly. Rosa was staring. Eli had opened his mouth to redirect her when Tomas walked back to stand beside his sister, and the two of them exchanged one of those sibling looks that children use when they have already decided something and are about to let you in on it. Eli recognized the look. He did not like what usually followed it. He said, "Did you find something?" Rosa said, "Papa, you said we could pick anything." "That's right. Anything on the shelf?" Tomas said, "What about something not on the shelf?" Eli looked at his son. "What do you mean?" And Rosa, who had always been the one to say the thing out loud that other people were only thinking, turned and pointed across the mercantile at the Apache woman and said in a voice that carried through the whole room, "We want her to come home with us. We want her to be our mother." The mercantile went quiet in that way a room goes quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Eli felt the heat rise in his face. The rancher by the window turned back around. Peabody looked up from the ledger. Ishke turned from the shelf she'd been examining and looked at Rosa with an expression that was very calm and very careful and possibly, somewhere far behind the composure, surprised. Eli crouched to Rosa's level and kept his voice low. He said they could not pick a person, that people were not things on shelves, that what Rosa had said was, he searched for the right word, forward. He was embarrassed the way a parent is embarrassed when a child says the true thing at the wrong volume in the wrong place. He looked up at Ishke and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am." Ishke studied him a moment. Then she looked at Rosa. She said, in English that was careful and precise, "Your children are very direct." Eli said, "Yes, ma'am, they are." She gathered her baskets, spoke another word to Peabody, and walked out into the afternoon sun. Rosa watched her go with the expression of someone who had not changed their opinion at all, only been forced to defer it. That night at supper both children were quiet. Eli made corn bread and salt pork and watched them push the food around their plates with the focus of small engineers working a problem that hadn't resolved itself. He asked what they were thinking, and Tomas said, "Nothing." Rosa said, "When is she coming?" Eli put his fork down and told her that Ishke was not coming, because you could not simply invite a person into your life because you wanted her there. Rosa looked at him with those brown eyes and said, with the particular clarity of a 6-year-old who does not yet understand why the true things are complicated, "But why not?" Eli did not have a satisfying answer. He said it was late and they should go to bed. He did not sleep well that night. He told himself it was the heat. He told himself it was the fence section that still needed fixing. He did not look too closely at the fact that, for the first time in 8 months, the silence in the house felt less like a sentence and more like a gap something might fill. 3 weeks passed. Eli rode the fence line and branded the late calves and repaired a section of roof the last storm had worked loose. Rosa asked about Ishke twice more, and he redirected her both times. He told himself the matter was closed. Then, one Thursday afternoon, coming back from the south pasture, he found both children sitting on the porch with the Apache woman. A half-finished basket lay across her knees. Rosa sat beside her, watching the movement of her fingers. Tomas sat on the step below, pretending to whittle, which meant he was listening. Eli pulled his horse up and stared. Ishke looked up at him without apology. She said she had been passing on the road with 2 women from her band, and the children had called out from the fence. They had asked if she would show them how the basket was made. She had decided there was no harm in it. She said all of this without the defensive posture a person adopts when they think they've overstepped, because she did not think she had. Eli stood there a moment with his hat in his hands. He looked at his children, who were watching him with the alertness of people awaiting a verdict. He looked at the unfinished basket, a white and black geometric pattern in tight coiled willow, and it was, objectively, beautiful. Then he said the only reasonable thing and asked if she'd stay for supper. She gave him that measuring look. Then she said yes. What followed at the kitchen table was not comfortable. Eli was not a man who talked easily, and Ishke was not a woman who filled silences that did not need filling. Tomas asked questions about the basket pattern, about where she lived, about whether the Apache really ate what people said they ate. Ishke answered each question without irritation. The basket pattern was called sisal, a water design, because water was the most important thing the desert had. She lived in a camp east of the Dragoons with her grandmother and several other families. She did not ask what people said the Apache ate, but told him what she ate: deer, rabbit, mesquite bean bread, agave hearts roasted in the ground, acorns in the fall that her grandmother ground into flour and mixed with red berries. When she said mesquite bean bread, Rosa asked what that tasted like. Ishke thought about it and said something between sweet and smoky, and that you had to try it to understand it, because there was no other thing it tasted like exactly. Eli had added a handful of dried herbs to the stew, without thinking. He was not much of a cook, and had developed the habit of throwing things in and hoping for the best. Ishke looked at the pot and asked, "What is in the broth?" He told her he wasn't certain. She asked to see his herb shelf, and he showed her, and she examined the jars and said he had cliff rose bark in there, which was not a thing you put in stew. She moved several items to a different shelf and picked out something he'd labeled only desert yellow, and told him it was Mormon tea, and that a small amount was fine for flavor. She put the cliff rose back without comment, in a way that was instructive without being superior. She left before dark. The children stood on the porch and watched her go down the road until she was out of sight, and Rosa turned to Eli and said, "She's coming back." He said he didn't know that. Rosa said she is. She was right. Ishke came back the following week, and the week after that. What started with the baskets slowly widened into something harder to name. She sat with Rosa on the porch and taught her how to prepare the willow withes, how to soak them, split them to the right thickness with a thumbnail, and coil them in a spiral that grew from the center outward. She had the patience of someone who had learned to teach from a woman who was herself patient, and she extended that patience to Rosa in full. Rosa, who was not naturally patient, worked harder at the baskets than she worked at almost anything else, because Ishke's attention was a thing worth earning. She showed Tomas how to read the ground, how a heel print tells you the weight of a person and the urgency of their pace, how a broken stem tells you the direction of travel, and, if you know the dew patterns, the rough time it was broken, how a rabbit's track reads differently from a jackrabbit's, and how a coyote disguises its gait, and why. Tomas took to tracking with the specific intensity of a boy who has been waiting all his life for someone to show him the thing he was born to notice. He started waking before the heat arrived to check the yard for prints. Eli watched all of this happen. He watched it the way a careful man watches something he does not yet have the right word for. There was a morning in late August when he came around the side of the barn and found Ishke teaching Rosa how to prepare soapweed yucca root for washing hair. She had brought a small pouch of it, and Rosa was mashing it in a stone bowl Ishke had carried from the camp, and Ishke was guiding her hands and talking to her in a low voice, partly in English and partly in Chiricahua, and Rosa was laughing at herself for making a mess of it. Eli stopped where he was, because what he was watching was the kind of small, ordinary moment he had not seen in his house in 8 months, and something shifted in his chest that he did not examine. She told stories at the table, the way that becomes natural between people who eat together often enough. Small stories, offered in the pauses of a meal or when the children asked. She told them that the Chiricahua did not say the names of the dead aloud for a certain time after the dying, because a name was not just a sound but a kind of rope, and you did not keep pulling on a rope when someone had already let go of their end. Eli heard that and went quiet for a long time. She told them about a mountain in the Dragoon Range that her grandmother called the place where the sky rests, where the air stayed cold even in August, and there were pines so old that no one living could say when they had started. She told them that the desert teaches you to wait, and that waiting is not the same as doing nothing. Waiting is what you do when you are paying attention. Rosa listened with her whole body. Tomas pretended not to listen, but never left the room when she was talking. Eli Hatch, sitting across the table with a cup of coffee he had forgotten to drink, found himself doing the same. One afternoon in early September, a still blue afternoon before the rains came back, she arrived without the children having invited her, and asked if Eli needed help with anything. He had been struggling with the north fence posts, which had set crookedly after the last rain softened the ground. She spent 2 hours beside him in the sun, handing tools and holding post vertical while he tamped the earth, and they worked without needing to say much because the work itself was conversation enough. At the end of it, she looked at the posts and said they'd hold the winter. He believed her. He went inside to get water, and when he came back out she was washing her hands at the pump, the late afternoon light full on her, and he stood in the doorway a beat longer than he needed to before he remembered to move. He thought about that moment for several days. He did not know what to call it, only that it had changed the shape of something. If this story is moving you, I'm glad. Stick with it. The best part is still ahead. He did not know what to do with any of it. The town of Tres Cruces had views about what it meant for a white rancher to have an Apache woman visiting his ranch regularly, and those views were not charitable. A rancher named Gerber, who ran cattle on the east side of the valley, stopped Eli at the feed store one afternoon and said something about maintaining the right kind of example for children. Eli told him he'd take it under advisement, which was the polite frontier way of telling a man to tend his own fences, and Gerber went away in a dark mood. The minister at the small church on Sycamore Street made a point of being on his porch whenever Ishka's cart passed, and offered no greeting. A woman from the Ladies' Aid Society came by with a pound cake and some measured observations about impressionable children and the importance of familiar customs, and Eli thanked her for the cake. He thought about all of this at night, after the children were in bed. He thought about what Clara would have said. Clara had been a practical woman with a generous mind, and he thought she would have pointed out that the children were louder and more alive than they had been in months, that the kitchen smelled better, that the ranch was running with more sense than it had all year, and that the only people complaining were people with nothing better to do with their afternoons. He thought she would have been right. He thought also about what it cost Ishke to ride the road past Gerber's fence in the minister's house. She had never spoken of it. When he finally asked whether her visits to the ranch caused her any difficulty among her own people, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said her grandmother had told her she was free to make her own path, and that her grandmother was the only person whose opinion she had ever organized her life around. Eli said that sounded like a person worth knowing. Ishke said yes. He also thought about the fact that she had not had it easy. She had lost her own mother at 12, she'd mentioned to the children once in passing, and had been raised almost entirely by the grandmother, who was strict and demanding, and by all accounts a genuinely formidable woman. She had learned her medicine knowledge, her tracking, her basketry, her reading of desert water and weather, all from that one source. A woman who had decided her granddaughter would know how to take care of herself and the people around her, and who had not been gentle about teaching it. Ishke did not speak of this as hardship. She spoke of it the way she spoke of most things, plainly, as fact, with the quiet assurance of a person who knows what she is made of and where it came from. There were evenings now when Ishke stayed late enough that the children fell asleep at the table and had to be carried to bed, and then she stayed a little longer, drinking coffee that had gone cold, not saying much. Those silences had changed. In the beginning they had been careful, inhabited by an awareness of ground rules neither of them had spoken, but both understood. Now they were easier, the kind of quiet you get between two people who have stopped needing to perform anything for each other. One such evening, Eli asked her why she kept coming. He said it plainly. He understood why the children wanted her there, but she had her own reasons for everything she did, and he was asking what those were. She thought about it. She said her grandmother had told her when she was a girl that the loneliest kind of knowledge is the kind nobody wants from you. She had spent a long time knowing things about this country, how to read it, how to live in it, how to tend it, that the people around her mostly did not want to hear. The children wanted to hear it. That made the visiting feel like something more than visiting. Eli said, "And what does it feel like on the other end of that, when someone wants to hear what you know?" She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Like ground under your feet after a long time on the horse." He nodded. He said, "I know that feeling." It was September when the wash came up. The monsoon rains had been building for a week, arriving in the afternoons and moving on before the ground had time to absorb them. Eli had been watching the arroyo west of the south pasture. Desert arroyos are deceptive things. They can sit dry for months and then go from nothing to a 5-foot surge in less time than it takes to cross one. He had told the children twice, and then 3 times specifically to Tomas, that they were not to go near the wash when the sky looked like rain. Tomas was 9 and was Tomas, which meant he had interpreted this as applying to a different kind of sky than the one currently overhead. He had taken Rosa to the south pasture to look for the track of a bobcat he'd found the day before, a genuine and interesting thing and not unreasonable on its face, except for the part about the sky. Ishka had come that morning to bring a jar of agave salve she'd prepared for Rosa's chapped hands, a thick, faintly sweet preparation her grandmother had taught her to make from the inner pads of the century plant, rendered down slow and mixed with a small amount of tallow. She had been in the yard talking to Eli about the south fence, which she had noticed had 3 posts working loose and needing to be reset before winter, when he heard it. Not thunder, something lower. The grinding sound of water moving fast with weight behind it, brush and silt, and whatever the mountain had decided to give up that afternoon. He was running before he had finished understanding what the sound meant. He did not tell Ishke to stay back, because he did not have the breath for it, and by the time that thought arrived, she was already running alongside him. The arroyo had gone from dry creek bed to running in minutes, the way desert water does when it has been piling up on stone slopes with nowhere to go. It came off the high country brown and fast and cold, a 4-foot surge carrying chunks of brush, a section of old fence rail, and a rolling froth of foam at the leading edge. Tomas was on the near bank, frozen. Rosa had been on the gravel bar in the middle, had gone there to look at something, a striped stone or a piece of interesting wood, the kind of investigation she was always conducting, and the gravel bar was disappearing as the level rose. The water was at her ankles, and she was standing very still, the way a child stands when she has just understood the size of her mistake. Eli shouted her name. Rosa looked up. She looked at the water around her feet, then at her father, and her face had that expression small children make when they need a grown-up to fix something immediately. He went in without thinking through it. The current was not deep on him, hip-height, but it moved with purpose, and the bottom was shifting gravel that gave way without warning. He took 2 steps and went down on one knee, got up, took 2 more. The water at Rosa's knees now. He was still 6 feet from her. Ishke moved past him. She moved with direction and purpose, and she moved through the current the way a person moves through something they have moved through many times before. Lower than he was, weight back, arms spread wide for balance, reading the water's pull with her feet before she committed her weight. He understood later that she had crossed running desert water many times. The arroyos of the Chiricahua country were not exotic obstacles, but ordinary features of her world, and her body had learned them the way his body had learned the fence line. She reached Rosa in 7 or 8 steps, came down to her level, lifted her clean off the gravel bar, and turned back toward the near bank, the water at her hips, her feet finding the bottom with a certainty that Eli watched in something close to disbelief. She came out on the near bank and set Rosa down on solid ground. Rosa grabbed her round the neck and did not let go. Eli came out behind them. He was soaked through and breathing hard and had torn his knee on a rock going down. He stood on the bank and looked at his daughter, alive, holding on to the Apache woman, and he did not say anything for a while, because the right words were not available yet. Then Tomas, from somewhere behind him, said very quietly, "She didn't even fall." Eli sat down on the bank. He pressed his hands against his knees and stared at the water, still running hard, still making that low carrying sound, and breathed. Ishke was holding Rosa and her eyes were closed, and what Eli saw in that moment was not a visitor and not a figure from some other world, but a person who had been in the right place and known exactly what to do, who had known because she had spent her whole life learning this country from the inside. She had not hesitated for a second. He looked at her. After a moment she opened her eyes and looked back at him. The water ran past. The mountains above the valley were running with thin silver lines of runoff. He said, "Thank you." She said, "She's all right." Rosa, still holding on, said in a muffled voice, "I want to go home now." They walked back, the 4 of them, wet and quiet through the afternoon. The creosote and the sage had opened up in the rain the way they do, that particular smell of desert after water that is nothing like anywhere else on earth. Tomas walked beside Ishke and gave her a detailed account of what he had been tracking when the water came, partly because he needed to talk, and partly because he needed her to know it had started as a reasonable expedition. Ishke listened to all of it. She asked about the bobcat track, where he had found it, what direction it had been heading, and Tomas answered with the seriousness of a small scholar who has just been treated like an expert. Back at the house, Eli built up the fire and found dry clothes, and made coffee and did the practical things. He brought Ishke a dry blanket, and she sat by the fire with it around her shoulders, and accepted the coffee without comment. The children fell asleep in the front room before the evening properly started, Tomas in the chair, Rosa curled on the braided rug, a thing they had not done since they were much smaller. Eli sat across from Ishke at the kitchen table, and they were quiet together for a long time. Not a gap to fill, a place to rest. He said, eventually, "How long have you been crossing water like that?" She said, "My whole life. My grandmother taught me." She said, "Water is not your enemy, and it is not your friend. It simply is. You have to learn to be in it on its own terms, not yours." He said, that was a good way of thinking about more than just water. She said, yes. He looked at his coffee cup. He said, "The children need you. I think you already know that, but I don't want to use the children to say what I actually mean." He stopped. "I am not good at this." She said, "Say it anyway." He said he had been alone for 8 months and had thought he was managing well enough. He said he was beginning to understand the distance between managing and actually living. She came from a different world, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. And the town had its views, and he did not care about the town's views. And her people had their own considerations, and those mattered to him, and he was prepared to go and speak to whoever needed to be spoken to, if that was something she wanted. He had no right to ask anything of her. He said it anyway. He held out his hand across the table, palm up. The fire shifted and settled. In the front room, one of the children turned over in their sleep. Outside, the last of the rain moved off east, and the sky began to clear, and the smell of wet desert came in through the window. She looked at his hand for a long time. Then she placed her hand in it. She said she would need to speak with her grandmother first. He said of course. She said her grandmother would want to meet him. He said he would welcome that. She said the meeting would not be easy, and that her grandmother was not easily impressed by good intentions. He said he had some experience being the least impressive person in a room, and that he would do his best. Something shifted in her face, very slightly, in a direction he understood as warmth. Her grandmother's name was Nyeche-Shi. Ishke said it meant something like the one who holds the thread, a name given because she was the person in the camp who remembered things, who kept the old knowledge alive and connected it to the present. She was perhaps 70. She received Eli Hatch at the entrance of her dwelling on a cool morning in early October, and regarded him for a long time without speaking. He had brought a cured deer hide and a sack of salt, because Ishke had told him these were things her grandmother found useful, and he had not wanted to arrive with something ornamental. He stood straight, and did not fidget, and did not look away, and after the long silence the old woman said something in Chiricahua, and Ishke translated. He had the posture of a man who was afraid but had decided not to show it, and that was the correct response. The conversation lasted most of 2 hours. The old woman asked about the children, their ages, their natures, what they were like when no one was watching. She asked about the land he worked and how he worked it, whether he used it or tended it. She asked about the year Clara died and what he had done afterward, whether he had people of his own to lean on, what he did when the darkness came. He answered all of it honestly, which included admitting that he did not always do well with the darkness, and that he was still learning. She asked whether he thought he was bringing Ishke into his world, or whether he understood it moved both ways. He said both, and that he was still figuring out what the second part required. She asked what his plan was, concretely, for the ways the world would make the arrangement difficult. He talked through it. She listened without expression, and asked pointed follow-up questions, and when it was over she spoke to Ishke at some length. He asked, later, what the old woman had said. Ishke was quiet for a moment. Then she said, She said that the Chiricahua do not choose their relatives. They recognize them. The wedding was on a Saturday in November, when the first blue tones of winter were showing on the upper faces of the dragoons, and the air had gone clean and cold in a way that made everything look sharper than it had all summer. They held it outside between the ranch house and the cottonwood tree on the rise. Eli had gone up to the rise the evening before and told Clara what was happening. He said the children were good. He said he hoped she understood. He stood there until the feeling had said what it needed to say, then walked back down. Ishke's grandmother came, and 2 of her aunts, and a group of women from the camp who brought beadwork and a folded blanket in the red and black Chiricahua pattern, woven for cold nights in a high place. Eli's neighbor Rafferty came with his wife and a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for an occasion. A preacher came from Tucson, who had worked among the Apache bands for years, and performed the ceremony in both English and something close enough to Chiricahua that the old grandmother inclined her head. Rosa held the ring box. She had asked for this task with such gravity that the question of whether anyone else might hold it never came up. She stood with her spine straight, both hands on the box, a very serious expression held through the whole ceremony. Tomas stood beside his father and looked at his boots through most of it, but looked up at the exact moment that mattered. The November light came over the mountains at a low angle, long and warm and a little gold, and it lay across the dry grass and the faces of the people standing there and the mountains behind them. Ishke wore a deerskin dress with a pattern of beadwork her grandmother had put along the shoulders over the previous 2 weeks. Small figures in turquoise and white that represented, she had told Eli, safe crossing. She had let her hair down, which she almost never did. It moved in the wind off the mountains. She carried herself the way she always did, not performing anything, simply herself and present, which is a harder thing to keep up than it looks. Eli took her hand when the preacher asked him to, held it, looked at her, and said the words. She said them back. Her voice did not waver. When it was finished, Rosa pulled Ishke down to her level and said something in her ear that no one else could hear. Ishke listened, then straightened up and laughed. A full laugh, the kind that is not performed for anyone, the kind you do not hear from a person until you know them well enough that there is nothing left to protect. It came out completely and without reservation, and moved through the yard, and Eli heard it and understood in that moment what his house had been missing all year. Not a name, not a face, just that sound. A woman who was home. Tomas, 9 years old and opposed on principle to being seen having feelings in front of other people, reached out and took hold of Eli's sleeve. Eli covered his son's hand with his own, and they stood that way until the preacher had folded up his book. In the years that followed, the Sulphur Springs Ranch became a different kind of place. Ishke organized the herb shelves by season and use, labeled in both English and Chiricahua, and taught Eli which plants he had been wasting, and which ones were doing real work he hadn't given them credit for. She read weather off the mountains, and the behavior of the animals in a way that seemed like a trick, until you understood it was just attention paid over a long time. She showed him how to manage the horses in heat and cold, using methods she'd learned from women who had worked with horses longer than the territory had been a territory. She brought her grandmother to the ranch several times that winter, and the old woman walked the property with the attention of someone taking a careful survey. She made no criticism, but she had several suggestions about the placement of the windbreak and the location of the second well, and Eli followed all of them, and they were right. Tomas kept reading the ground. By the following spring he was finding tracks that Eli had walked right past, and by fall he had taught 2 other boys on neighboring ranches the same skill, which Ishke found quietly funny. Rosa made a basket that was actually finished, which took most of the winter, and she gave it to Ishke's grandmother, and the old woman received it with a look that Rosa carried with her for a long time. The town of Tres Cruces adjusted, the way towns do, unevenly, slowly, with more grace from some quarters than others. Gerber relocated the following spring. The minister stayed but reduced his visibility when Ishke was in the street. A younger woman from the Ladies' Aid Society came to visit in genuine friendliness and brought a recipe, and this time Eli thanked her and meant it. Grief, when it has been living in a house for a long time, does not leave all at once. It just starts to make room. Something warm and daily and concrete grows alongside it, and the grief finds its proper size, which is large but no longer the whole room. The rise behind the barn still had its stone and its cottonwood, and the cottonwood grew. Rosa still went up there sometimes, alone, but the rooms of the house were full again, and the kitchen smelled of something other than salt pork and quiet. And at the table in the evenings there was talking and arguing, and the specific noise of a family working out who it was. Rosa, years later, when she was grown and someone asked how her mother had come to the ranch, said that she and Tomas had simply done the honest thing. They had seen what they needed and said so, which is what children do before the world teaches them to be more careful. She said, "Tomas and I didn't choose a gift that day. We chose a direction, and Daddy was smart enough to follow it." That is a true thing. And if you've stayed with this story until now, I'm glad. If it moved you, please like this video and subscribe. There are more stories in this country, and I'd be glad to bring them to you.